Well, welcome virtually to Oxford. I'm in Oxford. I just arrived this afternoon. I came from my farm in Wales yesterday, and I'm absolutely thrilled to have this opportunity to renew our conversation because we did a podcast a year or so ago. And I have to say, it made a very profound impact on me because you are a doctor, you trained as a medic, and then you became interested through your patients in nutrition. That's right, isn't it? Maybe you should start by just saying a little bit about your journey.
Yeah, much different path to the same place as you in many ways. I think you've taken 50 years on your farm there to prove the power of the soil beneath your feet as a mechanism for life. And so I took a slightly different path to that same conclusion, which was through allopathic Western medicine, trained as a medical doctor at the University of Colorado, and then did all my postdoctoral work at the University of Virginia for 10 years. And specialized in internal medicine, then endocrinology and metabolism, which looks at the systems of communication within the body and then the way in which energy is produced to coordinate life. And so that took me ultimately into cancer research and understanding the damage done to the system that eventually results in cancer as communication and ultimately production of energy is undermined in that human cell that would then lead to the advent of cancer. And so through that, kind of tunnel or rabbit hole into cancer, found myself back out to the story of food systems and its impact on this cancer epidemic that really mounted in the 1990s in such an unexpected way. If you look at some of the reports that were put together, not just in the US, but globally in the 1970s, they were predicting what was going to happen by year 2000. And they predicted the internet, they predicted changes in Wall Street, they predicted global climate issues. They failed in one front, was to predict the advent of the biggest chronic disease epidemic.
Well, let me stop you there because I want to check, because I think a lot of people have heard this information that the incidence of a whole range of cancers previously relatively uncommon has gone through the roof. But before I do, just to say, because I forgot to introduce myself, I'm Patrick Holden. I farm in West Wales, and as you said, Zach, we are approaching the 50th anniversary of our arrival back in the 70s on the farm in West Wales. It was a community farm set up to farm in a sustainable way, and we've endured for nearly 5 decades, and we're going to have a big party, of course, in the summer. You're invited. And my dad trained as a doctor, actually, here in Oxford, just before and during the war. So for me, the interest in medicine and health is profound. But is it really true that the incidence of cancer has risen as much as you were just saying? Can you share a few more statistics? I mean, is it all kinds of cancers? What's the accurate information about that?
It is nearly all types of cancer. Really started to accelerate in its penetration in the general population across the globe, but most notably in industrialized nations in the 1990s. And so this was led by leukemias and lymphomas, which are diseases of the bone marrow and bloodstream. These are typically the hallmarks of an environmental injury. And so there's a few places in the body where environmental injury or chemical injury to the human body shows up, and the bone marrow is typically first, and then followed by that is bladder cancer, thyroid cancer, and liver cancer. And all 4 of those in a very concerted and symphonic way all went up at the same time.
And it's not to do with longevity and not dying of other causes. I'm just checking.
That's right. Yeah. And so life expectancy in 1992, when, right before this whole advent occurred, was the same as it was in 2002. And it was actually lower by 2012, life expectancy. So it wasn't like we were living longer. In fact, now projected to be living shorter over that period of time. So this was not a diagnostic dilemma.
And what is the conventional explanation of that now?
I think there's a general agreement that it's an environmental injury. I think that there's a hesitancy in the industry at large to suggest that it's any single cause, but there's an general understanding that doesn't actually trickle down to the conversation at the bedside. I'll note that if you end up with cancer, by and large, you're told by your conventional, allopathic doctor that there's nothing you can do about this. It just is happening to you. It's the result of, a disease that's leaping out of an otherwise healthy body. You need to do chemosurgery, radiation. There's nutrition doesn't matter. Then what your hours of sleep doesn't matter. There's nothing you do with your lifestyle to change your outcome with cancers.
So it still hasn't permeated mainstream medical thinking that diet is one of the causes. Not diet, I mean the method of agriculture and the contamination of food is one of the principal influence on the increase in cancers.
That's right. It's still lacking from the education system, the connection between soil systems, food systems, and human biology, particularly cancer. But we should back up for a second to note that it's not just cancers that blew up in 1992. It was also autoimmune diseases of all sorts. Autoimmune thyroid disease, autoimmune gut diseases of inflammatory bowel disease, including Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, also neurologic conditions in children. Attention deficit disorder became a thing. In adults, we saw the advent of chronic pain syndromes, chronic fatigue syndromes, fibromyalgia. We saw the advent of new skin conditions of autoimmune legacy. We also saw the acceleration of juvenile, in children, rheumatoid arthritis explode. We saw the advent of autoimmune conditions of internal organs. And then on the neurologic side, with attention deficit and hyperactivity and autism all taking off at the same time in children, we saw the corollaries in adults being also, deficits in sensory processing like attention deficit and sleep disorders and sexual dysfunction, but also, of course, Parkinson's disease in men and Alzheimer's in women, all hockey sticked at the same time.
So these statistics you're quoting are beyond dispute because they're facts.
Yeah.
But how many, maybe I should ask you, you've already entered into the explanation of why it is that the causes of so many of these previously uncommon diseases directly linked to chemical interference, some of which comes from the industrialization of agriculture. But mainstream thinking just says it's environmental, there's nothing you can do about it. How many people are of your thinking now? Is there a growing number in your medical community who come to the same conclusions that you have reached?
Certainly. We're in the 10,000s for sure. So there's many scientists now that have resolved that chemical agriculture, the residues of chemical agriculture in our food and water systems are ground zero of the biologic dysfunction that led to this explosion of disease. What happened in chemical agriculture in the 1990s was notable in that it was the advent of genetically modified crops that allowed us to treat at very high concentrations the very food that we eat with herbicides and pesticides that had previously been reserved for very spot treatment of weeds and, in the event of an insect, overcoming the crop, it would be treated. But now we have, with the advent of GMO, the ability to broadcast both herbicides and pesticides across our crops chronically throughout the growing season without regard to the actual advent of a problem. So they're used as a preventative measure instead of a treatment. And this led to an extraordinary acceleration or accumulation of the residues in our food and water systems. And this
specifically glyphosate, the active ingredient of Roundup, and the glyphosate in formula, which I know is supposed to be 100 times more toxic than glyphosate on its own. You've identified that as one of the key contaminants. That's right, isn't it?
That's been I started my own basic science laboratory in 2012. And for the last 10 years, we've been studying this direct effect of the herbicide glyphosate, as well as others, on human biology directly. And up until this point, up until the last decade, really, the industry and government regulators around the world were acknowledging that there was no cancer risk to these herbicides and pesticides. And this remains the dogma that's out there right now. But the science has now way surpassed the dogma. it just takes about 20 to 25 years before science becomes bureaucratic, practice. And so we've got another 15 years, I think, before we see the final acceptance of the reality that we have devastated our public health through the increasing use of these chemicals at very high concentrations in our food and water
Well,
system.
I was in France the other day in a field that was supposed to be regenerative agriculture, and with a bunch of people from the food industry. And I was the only person who knew a little bit more about agriculture in this group. So I started asking the farmer questions, and he was using what's called cover crops to cover. You all know all about this, to cover the field in winter. So of course I said to him, what's your farming system? Have you got a rotation? And also, how do you kill off the cover crop? And of course, he said Roundup. And I said, slightly innocently, I said, I thought the French government was going to ban Roundup. And he said, oh, no. He said, the farming community lobbied the minister and persuaded them not to ban Roundup because it's such a crucial part of regenerative agriculture. So I thought that was really, really interesting. And you will know this as well, that just because we're not growing GMO crops in the United Kingdom, it does not mean that Roundup is not widely used. It's used more or less universally as a pre-harvest desiccant, sprayed onto wheat and other grain crops immediately before they're harvested or within 8 or 10 days. And it's also used to kill off grass. So in Wales, where I farm, you see orange fields all over Wales because it's become a cheap way of killing off an old pasture before reseeding or planting with a grain. So I'm not saying it's reached the same levels of application that it has with you in the US, but it's very, very widely used. And most of the farming community think it's safe. And they get quite agitated if you say it isn't.
Yeah, and so a couple of things on that. It was actually that use as a desiccant or drying agent rather than a weed killer was actually a farmer near you in Wales, I think, in 1991. That was the first to realize that they were going to lose their crop due to weather moving in too early that year. And so they sprayed the wheat to try to get it harvested before the weather moved in, and it worked beautifully. Within 24 hours of spraying their wheat with glyphosate, they had a dry wheat field and were able to harvest before the storm came. And so this news got out, and within 1 year, you had tens of thousands of farmers worldwide hearing about this and the opportunity to A, in northern climates beat the winter, and B, in more southern climates to get 2 growing seasons out of every year. Instead of waiting for the wheat to mature to dryness, you could spray prematurely, get it dead, harvest it, and get a second crop in the ground. It was a boon for farmers, in many different climates. And so it was one of the fastest adoptions. Desiccant usage, I think, outpaced GMO acceptance on the seed side.
Well, especially I never knew that it started in Wales. That's completely fascinating, but it doesn't surprise me because in a very wet climate, we grow oats and peas for combining on our farm. Of course, there's always a challenge in late August or early September to get the combine through them before the rains come. And also because we're organic and we never use any herbicides or pesticides, we have quite a strong undergrowth of all sorts of weeds, which we welcome, of course, but obviously getting near to harvest, they do make the crop moist. So it's unsurprising. But what is also related to that directly is that farmers think that it's better to use Roundup because you cannot plow that way. And so the anti-ploughing movement has gained momentum tremendously in the United Kingdom because of the view that it prevents soil carbon degradation and oxidation, etc. So it's a double irony, it seems to me, that the Roundup is so defended by so-called regenerative farmers. And I don't know what we're going to do about that, but it's a big issue. And I'm sure some of the people coming to the conferences here in Oxford over the next 2 days would have that view.
I agree with you. And I would agree that, in overplowing and disking of fields can be more detrimental to the microbiome than a single application of herbicide, but that's at the soil level. For the consumer, when you spray the wheat or straw of the wheat or the rice before harvest, the residues are much higher for the consumer than if you just sprayed to kill your cover crop before the seed is planted. And so the use as a desiccant on things like soybeans and other legumes, the use on wheat and other products that have to be harvested dry is far more damaging to the consumer than a pre-treatment before the crop goes in the ground. So the timing at which harvest occurs to the spraying, I think, is a critical piece of the regulatory environment. And so if somebody uses glyphosate to knock down a cover crop before the beginning of the growing season, that's less of an impact on the consumer. On
Well,
soil,
what about on the soil microbiome, if I can use that term? I know it's not strictly accurate, but
that
on
is
the, yeah.
yeah, micro and macro biome. So the microbiome suffers radically under a single application of glyphosate any time of year. And springtime is a particularly harmful time to hit a field with glyphosate because a single application can kill 50% of your earthworm population, including 100% of your top dwelling earthworms. And when you start to undermine that macro life of the earthworms and nematodes, you start to really lose the coral reef of kind of biodiversity that leads to a healthy soil system. So
there's good science to show that Roundup or glyphosate kills earthworms, is there?
yes, yeah, that's been demonstrated, and it's you can just, if you doubt that, come over to the Midwest United States and you can throw shovels in any of our farm fields and find zero earthworms.
Wow.
A chronically farmed GMO corn soybean field cannot have earthworms in it after 4 to 7 years of crop rotation. We annihilate that nematode and earthworm population through chronic usage of GMO sprays and monoculture cropping. So definitely, not only is there science, there's real life application. You can walk on any farm and find this phenomenon throughout any agricultural system that's been using GMO for more than 7 years. So,
but do you have in America this same backlash against to defend Roundup because of min-till and zero-till systems, and farmers saying, look, we're keeping the carbon in the topsoil. It may cause damage, but that's offset by the gain of the not inverting the top layer of the soil microbiome, the soil biome, as it were. Do you have that?
That argument is definitely going on in conventional agriculture. In regenerative agriculture, it's been less of an issue in the U.S. There's a general acceptance that regeneration is going to be a step beyond organic. And so there's now, Rodale and the Rodale Institute in Pennsylvania, around 70 years, in conjunction with Patagonia, have put the money and effort behind creating the first regenerative organic certification for farmers in the U.S. and beyond. So that ROC standard is certainly eliminating the herbicides, the pesticides, as well as the overtilling. But by and large, what you see working in the U.S. is difficult to apply in places like the U.K., or even more difficult in places like India or parts of Africa, where you have farmers farming less than 2 acres. Because what works really well in the U.S. or Australia or Canada, where you have vast farmland of 1,000 to 10,000 acres, in Australia it can be 1 million acres. When these huge farms, it works very well to do high intensity mob grazing of cattle or other animals. Having a combination of cattle, swine, and poultry is a really powerful regenerative force, and eliminates the need, because the cattle come in and wipe out, knock down your cover crop, and then you go seed, and then they come in at the end of the season and they knock down your wheat straw, your rice straw, your corn stalks, whatever's there, and they can biodiversify those crops back into compost faster than any other system. So mob grazing works really well at scale in large ecosystems. Our team launched a nonprofit called Farmers Footprint a number of years ago, and we've been focused on helping innovation and change of psychology of farmers around the world towards this regenerative practice that eliminates the herbicides, pesticides, and the plowing, by looking at different mechanisms of different types of cover crop seeds that can be interseeded with your cash crop, so that you're not having to knock it down completely. You can actually do both. Also looking at systems where you can bring in small scale animal interruption of the soil and cover crops, etc., by cooperatively using grazing expertise to partner with crop growers. And so,
so two questions arising out of what you've just said. The first is, do you think that any use eventually is an endpoint of herbicides, fungicides, pesticides is really not compatible with the kind of systems that upon which regenerative farming is based? That's the first question. And then the second question related to what you just said about livestock. Do you see the role of livestock as being an integral part of regenerative agriculture or not?
Yeah, so the first question is, do herbicides and pesticides play a role in the future of regen, or is it absolutely necessary that it's gone? For farmers' footprint, we see progress over perfection as an important, understanding. Is you can't expect a farmer to immediately change their behavior 100% for 100% of their land. It takes about a 3 to 5 year period typically for a farmer to learn how to do what nature can do in a day. Nature can go regenerative organics. She's been doing it for 4 billion years. So no problem for nature to do biodiversity, vitality at the soil level. It's how this earth has come to be. The challenge is getting the farmer to have the right toolbox and right understanding of what to do in the event of challenges come up, or how to understand challenges like a weed coming up or an invasive species in there or a pest. And in the end, what you're doing is you're changing farmer psychology over a 3 to 5 year period, which then ultimately changes the soil management. The soil can respond much quicker. So herbicides, pesticides don't need to be part of that equation. I think that they necessarily are part of the transition, just because it takes time for a farmer to learn the tools of the new trade. The second question around, are animals necessary for regen? Not necessary, but a very compelling way to accelerate in different environments the regenerative success. And so what I would say is there is no template for regen that works universally. Regenerative agriculture is a systems science, and the systems that are going to work in Wales is going to be radically different than what looks to be happening in Botswana right now, or Zimbabwe, or Australia in the desert there. The desert north or southwest of the United States, a completely different scenario. So in each of these ecosystems, you have not only environmental factors, but also human factors, the cultures, the known education systems, the known indigenous wisdoms that are still present in some of these spaces. And so each location, when given the opportunity to rethink their relationship to soil, tends to create their own regenerative system that necessarily looks broader than soil, because you can't just look at soil management. You also need to look at the human resources, the built resources. And so, do you have storage and transportation distribution facilities that are decentralized enough to allow a farmer to get a value-added crop to the marketplace, or do they end up growing regenerative organic and then they have to store it in the silo up the road that mixes it with all of the conventionally grown corn, and they lose their value-added proposition that they were doing by growing healthier food? So in many places, there's a lack of built systems to support the farmer to their goal. And you have to have grace and understanding that takes time to change as well. So where activism has been harmful to progress is where we damn the stakeholders, right? We damn the farmer for using it Roundup, or we damn Bayer and Monsanto for making the damn chemical. We damn the agronomists for having an education that's based in chemical agriculture, not holistic systems. It's that activist mindset of everybody's doing it wrong that has kind of slowed down progress, I think. And we need to all realize we are, every single one of us, inhabitants, and we are ultimately partners to this earth that we live on.
I think it's lovely you're saying that, because I think there has been, understandably, there is so much anger in the world at the moment, and even within our own movement, there's been a tendency to polarize. And I even think, because I had a lot to do with the development of organic standards back in the 80s, that was entirely, I think, necessary at the time, but had the unintended consequence of polarizing the farming community between the bad guys who'd used chemicals and the good guys who gave them up and were morally superior. And I do myself feel very much at the moment that it's important to reconcile and to be open and to recognize that no one wants to do harm. We just get trapped in a system where the psychology of, the monoculture, what Vandana Shiva calls the monoculture of the mind, moves us into a system which has actually been, destructive and depleted our natural resources. But I think most farmers in their hearts now want to move in a different direction. And I think we have to find a way to help them do that. And you are showing such leadership in that, and I salute you for it.
Well, I think to that point, whether I'm doing a good job or not is almost irrelevant. But the fact is that the science is starting to get to a point where we're understanding that instead of saying you shouldn't use herbicides and pesticides because it's bad, we can actually say you can make herbicides and pesticides obsolete because the immune system and health of your soil and plants are so vigorous that
Yeah.
it's not possible for a pest. There is no role for the pest or the weed to come into the scenario. And we see this over and over again in well-done regenerative agricultural systems, is that farms that are overrun with multi-drug resistant, i.e. multi-herbicide resistant weeds, like in the Midwest United States, we have 7 states now that have been overrun with Roundup resistant weeds. And some of these are the size of Christmas trees. I mean, they are massive weeds that destroy combines if you hit one, in the middle of a wheat field or whatever. So they destroy, built systems, engineering systems. They will take down a sprinkler system. Like they are just incredible weeds that have engineered themselves to tolerate the high chemical environment that chemical ag has done. And if we do good regenerative practices for just 1 year on that farm, meaning we don't spray or plow in the fall, we don't spray or plow in the spring, we introduce biodiversity through cover cropping and mob grazing, the very next year there are 0 weeds on that property. There are 0 Roundup resistant weeds there because the weed was allowed to come to its maturation and do the work it was supposed to, which was heal the soil.
Yes.
Weeds and regenerative systems are understood to be part of the solution, not the problem.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I know that from my own experience. And you need to sort of read the biology of the field in a completely different way and realize that every plant is a messenger and has a story and is telling you something about the environment of which it is an expression. So I want to just jump back, if I may, though, Zach, because you came in, as we said at the beginning of this discussion, you came into agriculture through your increasingly disturbed observations of the failure, or I remember from our last conversation, of super foods like kale to improve the health of your patients. And I just wanted to bring in this. Yesterday, I went to Leeds from Wales to visit my aunt, who was it was her 95th birthday yesterday, and her daughter, my cousin, works in the our National Health Service, the so-called National Health Service, which is really the National Disease Treatment Service, because health and positive health is really not even included in the mindset of most people who work in the health service, who work so well as my dad did and my wonderful cousin does. And she was talking about, I said, how's it going? And she said, we really are on our knees. We have, an unstoppable increase in all these previously uncommon diseases, cancers. Her specialism is rheumatoid arthritis. And she got going and she said, we've got the most incredible drugs now to treat all these conditions. But she said, in her mother's case, she had leg abscesses. She's getting on, and she was on all these drugs, and they made them worse, and they made her sick. And her and her sister managed to get her off all these drugs, and she's so much better as a result. And she said, I'm not saying we don't need these drugs if people are really sick, but the health service has got itself into a real mess, has it not? Where the very drugs that we're using there's a sort of analogy, it seems to me, between the drugs that are used in human medicine, and what we've done in agriculture. Do you see the connection there? And what do you see as the way of getting out of that?
Yeah, the correlations are now undeniable in the science. There was a belief when I started, my medical training around 1990. 30 years ago, we thought that a healthy human body was a sterile human body. The farmer next door believed that a sterile field was a productive field, and so by disking all of the weeds and all biology off the surface of the soil, and then planting a really clean little long line of corn with these soldier-like columns of corn growing all year, that was thought to be really excellent farm management. Likewise, next door at the hospital, the doctor who completely annihilated all bacteria from their patient, viruses, fungi, yeast, So we had antivirals, fungals, antibacterials. And so by the 1940s, both farming and medicine were going in this sterilization belief system that germs were the problem for everything. And so the germ theory kind of crept into farming as much as it did into medicine. And so we wake up every morning as farmer or physician and ask, what do we need to kill today? With that, we undermine human health faster than we ever had with the advent of the herbicides, which are potent antibiotics. And so glyphosate has actually been patented as an antibiotic, an antifungal, an antiparasite, an antiprotozoa. It annihilates single cellular life within the farm field. And so it turns out that a residue of glyphosate remains in the food that you consume and unfortunately gets into the water that's coming off of that farm and running into the rivers, which then evaporates and ends up in our air, which ends up in our rain, which then falls on us. In the United States, we're now at 85% of our rainfall contaminated with Roundup, 85% of the air we breathe contaminated with Roundup. And so it's in our full water system now because it's a water-soluble toxin functioning as an antibiotic, antiparasite, antifungal, which means it's sterilizing all of those systems. Climate crisis hit harder in the 1990s than it had in the previous decades and has continued to hockey stick. Climate change is the phenomenon of sterilization of the ecosystems, just as the collapse of human health, autoimmune disease to cancer, to neurologic diseases to rapid aging, all related to this phenomenon of sterilization. And so this next step for us is to do something what you guys have done for 50 years, which is let the biodiversity lead the charge. And you've described your fields of being full of, quote unquote, weeds at the end of the year, which means you've got many, many species that are involved with the microbial and nutrient density of the soil system and therefore the food. And each one is seen as a sovereign and intelligent part of the system that is brilliant in its quorum sensing, which is a word that's used broadly in the microbiome. It says when you get enough species in population, you get hyper intelligent system behavior, where the system is able to create something that no part of, or no sum of the parts can create on its own. And so it's very exciting that what you guys have proven for 50 years on the farm is the new science of medicine, which is if you let biodiversity lead on that child, you're going to get a healthier advent. And just as you can make obsolete the herbicides and pesticides, you can make a child with a ecology within its gut and skin and system at large so vibrant and so biodiverse that not only is the antibiotic obsolete, the concept of disease is obsolete.
Yeah, the wisdom of nature, the wisdom of the fields, to quote a title of a book, a very influential book by a man called Massingham. I just want to say this, that I've got 4 boys who are oldest of whom is 21 and the youngest 15. Only one of them has ever been treated with antibiotics, and that was he burned himself at school and they gave it to him as an insurance dose. So that's really interesting. My children growing up on a livestock farm didn't ever need antibiotics.
Right.
I think that's quite rare today. I read that book, Missing Microbes, where I think there was a statistic in it that by the age of 20, the average American has had 20 doses of antibiotics. It may even be more than that now. And so we're living in an age of suppression, aren't we, of living organisms. We call that health. And in fact, it's the opposite of health.
As long as suppression is used as a friendly term for annihilation, I would agree. We are annihilating the microbiome. Not just in the U.S., but also in Europe now. In the U.S., it's about 855 prescriptions for every 1,000 man, women, and child a year. So 85% of the population is getting an antibiotic every year. That equates amazingly to 7 million pounds of antibiotics prescribed by doctors in the U.S. alone.
Oh my God.
7 million pounds pales in comparison to the 35 million pounds of antibiotics that are put into our feed animals. So this is cattle, poultry, and most of all swine as our target for 35 million pounds of antibiotics being put into those animals as prevention and treatment for invasive bacterial species that are dealing with a collapsing immune system of these animals that are grown in these unnatural environments of factory farming. And then that 35 million pales 10x to the 300 million pounds of glyphosate used in the United States annually. globally now we're at about 4 billion pounds of glyphosate used every year, potent antibiotic that gets into the water system, soil systems, sterilizing all of that downstream. And now you see climate collapse.
Okay. I mean, those statistics are, we need to know them, but they're also chilling and horrifying. So let's get a little bit more positive. Can we fix it? I mean, I sense you're an optimist, and I am too. The agricultural transition, let's call it that, and we could define it and describe it. But I think if we talk for long enough, we probably agree the key characteristics of the transition that is needed. It needs to happen in quite a hurry. And I think I can say this about the United Kingdom. It is, of course, happening in pockets, but it is happening nowhere near fast enough. So how can we move towards a tipping point? Because we really haven't got long. And with individuals like you around, I feel there's hope to accelerate the transition. What's your view about the way in which we can do that?
Yeah, I think so. The path that we've pulled for Farmers Footprint and our larger multinational NGO, which is Project Biome, 4 avenues of impact to accelerate this method of change. The first is awareness, the second education, the third innovation, and the fourth policy. And so those are the kind of the 4 avenues that need to in concert be accessed to create this sea change of behavior at the food systems level. And I think it's important that we think of it as a food systems phenomenon, for each of us to kind of adopt. But we do have to keep in the back of our mind that the vast majority of these cash crops that I'm talking about, or you and I have mentioned, corn, soybean, etc., aren't actually growing food. Those,
No.
One of the biggest crops globally is canola. And canola obviously is not a food; it's an oil for frying food, and it's horrific for the vascular system and cancer causing and all this stuff. So most of the land we grow is not actually for food, but it's made for processed additives, which would be artificial, processing of oils to artificial sugars like your high fructose corn syrup, and then even beyond that, much higher amount of acreage being used for
Ethanol.
And then after ethanol, you've got the textile industry. And so lots being grown for plastics that end up in polyesters in our clothes and et cetera. So most of the land usage that's under agriculture is not actually producing food. But the fastest way for us to make an impact on land right now, I think, is food systems as a leader in this systems change of regeneration and regeneration.
And you started with education and consciousness shift, which I think is 100% right.
Yeah,
So
you have to start with awareness before even education, right? Because the education shift has to come out of a sudden universal awareness of like, oh my gosh, we're not thinking correctly about this thing. And then we need to go about creating curriculum for children, into curriculum for doctors, into curriculum for farmers. It takes some concerted effort to get a global educational system to pivot. And I think it takes universal awareness. And fortunately, we're in the 6th great extinction with a 10,000-fold increase in extinction rates around the planet. We're losing a species to extinction every 20 minutes now. That is the awareness that we needed to create, this new awareness of how did it happen. So we are all finally coming to terms with the fact that whether you call it climate change or extinction, it's happening. And so, we can bicker all day long as to the cause. Is it glyphosate? Is it 5G? You can find people that believe both. But the reality is we have this extinction event going. It's in the context of a rapid destruction of ecosystems. And I think destruction of ecosystems is universally understood, whereas climate change can be argued. Destruction of ecosystems is very obvious. We're losing, soil systems. We're now at 97% of the arable, i.e. farmable lands in the world are either depleted or severely depleted of carbon and other critical nutrients, building blocks for life. And so now that we only have 3% of arable soils left that are considered verdant, we see our back against the wall. And farmers, the farm schools, you've mentioned a great one that's coming out of Ireland. I want you to mention that one. But in the United States, Soil Health Academy and some of these other groups, that I'd say John Kemp and his group there at Advancing Eco Agriculture is one of the greatest. They've transitioned some 2 million acres over the last 15 years to regenerative agriculture. And so these farm schools are phenomenal, but they've done a good job of helping us map the trajectory for the global arable lands. And it looks like we have 60 harvests left as of 2017. So 5 years, less than that maybe now. So we got 55 harvests left on the planet at the current rate of loss of topsoils and ecosystems within those topsoils. And so a really startling statistic to say that we will all be starving due to a lack of food infrastructure and agricultural underpinnings. And that's
So, but what are the ways in? Because I think people need to be worried, but also inspired in sort of equal measure, don't they, to make the change? And it's interesting that we started off, and you started off on this journey with health insights. And I've just got this feeling that a lot of people are worried about this growing incidence of all these health issues, and not just affecting their relatives, but actually affecting them. And I'm wondering what the degree to which you think making this connection and validating it, that the food that we eat today, that nearly all of us eat today, let's be honest about it. If you go shop in a supermarket today, I'm not blaming the supermarkets, but the food that most people eat is making them sick. I think that's a very, very strong statement to make. And of course, governments would shy away from it. But if you start to come to the realization that ultra processed food from chemical agriculture is actually undermining the health of the whole nation, I have the feeling that validating that statement, if there is solid evidence to show that it is true, that is going to mobilize quite a lot of people, because everybody worries about their health. I certainly worry about my health. What do you think?
You're spot on. Yeah, and that's been our job for 10 years in our laboratory and in concert with other scientists around the world. We've been focused on causation. And so the correlation between spraying Roundup and the advent of all these cancers, autoimmune disease, neurologic conditions is undeniable. But the industry and other stakeholders in the science community have been running around saying, well, that's just correlation, not causation.
Yes.
And Monsanto and Bayer keep telling us that glyphosate is safe, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't reach high enough concentrations to actually cause cancer to the population. Like, there's all this rationale for why we shouldn't worry about chemical agriculture. So we set out to show causation. In 2012, we started to be able to demonstrate the exact mechanism by which glyphosate injures any multicellular organism, be it a cow eating the high residues of glyphosate in their feed, or...
Well, you'll know about the work of Gilles Seralini, who tried to do exactly the same thing in about 2010. And he met with an incredibly well-coordinated counter-initiative by the chemical companies, who suggested that what he did was bad science. So how are you doing?
Well, fortunately, there's 10 more years of science behind us at this point. So it's getting easier to talk about the science, but it won't get published. And so to this day, we keep submitting peer-reviewed science stuff. We've got a few of them published, but it's unbelievable how difficult it is to get disruptive science into it. And so this whole peer-reviewed science thing, the reason why peers are reviewing is because they became experts in the old belief system. And so peer-reviewed science has a way of slowing down the transition of belief systems. And it's an unfortunate...
It's basic psychology, isn't it? If you've built a reputation by saying the earth is flat, and then a few weirdos like you come around and say it's round, it's undermining your professional status. That's so right. You can see how that it's self-perpetuating, isn't it? If all these peer reviewers, they're part of the old order.
Yeah.
But how can we speed this up? Because we need to, don't we?
We've gone through the nonprofit space instead of the peer-reviewed science as a better route, because actually none of the public reads peer-reviewed science anyways. And so the people that need to change are really the consumer and the farmer. We need to put the consumer in a position where they realize they can be producers as well. So the consumer needs to start growing food in their backyard, and then they need to start meeting the farmer. And so it turns out it's human relationship that creates the change, not science. Science can prove the problem, but the solution is human resources and human relationships. And that's what creates economy. That's what creates business. And so it's really been reassuring that the nonprofit is having global effect on changing the mindset of farmers and consumers alike, because we haven't had to bicker about the science. We simply say, do you care about your health? Yes. Do you believe your health is related to your gut? Unfortunately, 20 years of gut science has now proven that, from cancer to autoimmune disease to arthritis, all related to gut microbiome. And we have hundreds of thousands of publications in the peer-reviewed science to show that. So fortunately, the gut science has gotten us to a place where we understand that soil beneath our feet is the soil within our gut. And if you destroy the soil under our feet, you destroy the gut. If you destroy the gut, you get disease. So that constellation didn't exist in 2008 and 2010 in the way in which it does today. And
so that, in a way, the fact that it's new science and doesn't have to be countered might be psychologically a good way to start to move the science community onto new ground.
That's right. And I think move the public into a place of being part of the solution, rather than waiting for scientists to make the mandate that we go regenerative organic. We're seeing mothers of children who are sick want regenerative organic in their home now. And they don't have to see any more science. They know the food is undermining their children's health, and they can see the change happen within a matter of days. And that's to the excitement that you asked earlier of like, okay, lots of bad news. Can we heal it? The speed at which nature heals the dis-ease of a human body or a farm field is astonishing.
Yes.
It is logarithmically faster than the injury was. It can take 7 to 10 years to destroy a farm through chemical agriculture, through complete annihilation of its micro and macrobiome. It only takes 1 season to get it back online. And
well, I have some experience in that. It is incredible how quickly you can build vital biological health in an ecosystem if you farm in the right way. And of course, that's easily said, not so easily achieved. But nevertheless, I agree with you. But can we, because we've been going 48 minutes now, and it would be nice to bring some people in with some questions in a moment, but I don't want to until I want to bring something else up, because a lot of the people, I'm not sure how many are coming to the Oxford Real Farming Conference tomorrow and Friday, but it's a lot. Maybe it's minimum 500, it may be 1,000 by the time you add everyone up. And then there's another 500 farmers down the road, because there are 2 conferences going on concurrently in Oxford. One is the Challenger, which was set up by Colin Tudge and Graham Harvey about 12 years ago now. And then there's the Orthodox conferences, which has been going, I learned on the radio, since 1932, which was the old order, that we've just been referring to. But I personally believe, as we touched on earlier, that it's very important that we don't polarize this discussion. And in that connection, the then Prince Charles, now King Charles, launched an initiative called the Sustainable Markets Initiative in Davos at the World Economic Forum, which everybody thinks is, the sort of center of the other side, in January 2020. And the initiative he launched was based on his proposition that governments throughout the world, even though they're all now aware of climate change, and we have all the COPs, I was just at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, but governments on their own cannot do what is necessary to bring about the transition fast enough. They don't have the resources, and they never lead, they always follow, because they're following public opinion. They just want to get re-elected, and they're just not going to do it on their own. And his view was that you had to engage with the corporates, the business community, and only if we did that would we be able to get the change in the time available. However, many of the people coming to Oxford in the next couple of days are deeply distrustful, possibly for good reason, of the corporate world. They're worried about greenwash. They're worried that the term regenerative will be co-opted and diluted, and they don't trust these corporates to deliver. And controversially, perhaps, I've been engaging with these people and trying very hard not to sell out, because I'm not a seller-outerer. And I believe that we have to hold them to account. And as long as they measure their progress in a transparent way, I think we have to work with them. And I wondered what your view about that was, because you may not agree with me there.
Yeah, I would say that I work with, as you do, you work with a lot of corporations as well, and I think corporations are obviously one of the largest stakeholders in what is a modern food system, and many of them wield economies that are larger than most nation states.
Yeah.
So you get a Nestle, a General Mills, a Cargill. These companies wield so much money because they have become so centralized in global food systems, and those massive monopolies have to be part of the solution. Like, we can't damn them and demonize them. We have to bring them into the fold for being part of the solution. And my argument as them being the kind of the pivot point is that they don't actually pivot until their boards pivot, and their boards don't pivot until their profit margins are challenged, and their profits margins aren't challenged until the consumer changes. And so ultimately, I believe that all of us are the harbinger of change. And
I
so
agree.
as we sit here discussing this, each of you listening are the pivot point, and you will put the pressure on, the Nestle's of the world and the rest. And you already have, which it gets me excited that, we have Mark Schneider from, CEO of Nestle recently appointed, 5 years back. He is on a mad charge to become part of the solution. He wants 14 million tons of supply chain for Nestle to be regenerative organic by 2030. Right now they're at zero. And so, he made that public announcement before he even understood what regenerative agriculture was. That's why he called me
Yeah.
an organization, was to find out, what is that and how do we go about doing that? Obviously his supply chain, acquisition managers are freaking out because they're at zero. And so, but their board did not fire that CEO for saying that. And furthermore, it's just 6 months ago, about a year later, he comes out and announces that 97% of the foods that are put out by Nestle are bad for human health. And he didn't get fired. And so that means that board is wanting this CEO to pivot this company by 2030 to come in line with consumer demands, because they're seeing consumers not want the processed food that Nestle became, a food giant for. People are wanting real food again. And so each of you listening, I don't care what you eat. I don't care if it's lots of meat, lots of carbs. There's no, just eat real food, and you
Eat
start.
real food. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so that's the movement that we're all part of now, is a real food movement, a whole food movement rather than processed foods. And I would emphasize not pre-prepared foods as well. And so pre-prepared foods are very, detrimental to, the climate and, planetary stuff, because of the amount of waste that's created in those streams. So start to grow a little bit of food, start to cook your own food in the home again. For too long now, we've been outsourcing these simple day-to-day ways to be producers rather than consumers, and we have become wholly consumers, and we are consuming the very marrow out of the earth, and we need to give back to her now by becoming producers. And that's the exciting thing about a regenerative movement, is you become proactive solution based immediately, and you're no longer finger pointing. You personally become part of the solution, and that's what we all have the radical responsibility of becoming.
I think that's so right, so optimistic, and so empowering, because we are, as citizens acting as consumers of food, we are more powerful than the biggest food companies in the world. Because if we change, they have to listen, because we are the market. And I think that's a wonderful point to end on. But maybe just to bring up one other thing, which we mentioned in the conversation just before this started. You made the point that the ecosystem-based farming systems, which need to replace the industrial extractive ones we've got at the moment, will by their very nature help decentralize the centralized features that we have at the moment, which dominate. And I think that's an important point, because if you take Nestle, for instance, and they're purchasing all their commodity crops from monocultures at the moment, if they mean it about shifting to regenerative agriculture, the farmers that supply them will have to diversify. So in itself, that is going to mean decentralization. And so I think the force is there, the force is with us in a way, through the systems themselves, to help to decentralize the food systems. Do you agree with that?
I'm thrilled to say that it's already happening. I think that what you see happening in India is a great example of this. The average Indian farmer is still farming less than 2 acres. And globally, 70% of peoples are fed by a peasant farmer, farming less than 2 acres. 70% of the world is being fed by a peasant farmer. 30% are being fed by these chemical ag conglomerates. And so it is a falsehood that we need chemical ag to feed the world.
Well, bless you for saying that. Can you go on the chat? Because if I go on the chat, I think I'd disappear, or I did earlier, and see if anybody wants to raise any issues and questions, because maybe we should listen to the listeners now.
We have quite a few here. So we've got one that says, he has a link here as well, or they do, I'm not sure. Joe Hill, he Cancer research in the UK says on their website that pesticides do not cause cancer, and has the link there, Cancer Research UK, and looking for links to pesticides and herbicides. So why is that? So my team has been part of 196 scientific groups that have testified before the Environmental Protection Agency of the United States for the last 3 consecutive years. And every time we are met with blank stares from the regulators, because they've listened to 30 years of science from the industry saying this thing doesn't cause cancer. So despite 196 peer-reviewed scientific journal articles showing that it causes cancer this past year, no changes were made, and there was a rubber stamp approval of the use of glyphosate as a desiccant drying agent on our foods again. And so how is this possible that you've got scientists / regulators that are stuck in the dogma of the past? And it gets at this peer-reviewed science phenomenon, but it also gets at who's paying for a good science or a diverse perspective.
Well, how can we shift that? Because a lot of these cancer charities and cancer research organizations, they're well-intentioned. It seems so strange to me that they wouldn't be interested to know that the causes of these cancers are, as you said earlier, the chemical contamination through agriculture. It's weird that they wouldn't admit that.
Well, again, it's due to education and the slowness of the education system to change. So the answer is, what do we need to do? We need to change the education system. How do we change the education? We need to change awareness. But what's happening at the literal level of this document that he's got linked here, Joe, your science is showing a old model of cancer genesis or carcinogenesis. And so that what they're doing is they're looking at DNA damage as a model for cancer risk for a chemical. And it turns out that DNA damage is not the primary mechanism anymore by which we understand cancer to occur. Cancer actually is a metabolic rather than genetic injury that leads to the advent of cancer. The downstream genetic consequences of broken DNA that can't repair is because of upstream damage to the metabolism. But that has not yet crept into the metrics by which regulatory agencies will measure, is this a carcinogen or not? So we have the wrong metrics that are 50 years old, And so this is actually dating back to Watson and Crick in the 1950s, 70 years ago, that we thought that DNA damage was the cause of cancer. It turns out that DNA damage is a symptom of the upstream injury to the microbiome and the mitochondria within the human cells. So we have the wrong metrics by which the industry is hiding behind to say that these don't cause cancer.
That's really interesting. Do you think there's any chance that they would start to agree that and change the metrics?
Well, they're already changing, but again, it takes 25 years for the education system to pivot around new science because of the slowness of peer-reviewed science, because of the slowness of change in human philosophy and psychology. So all of these things are just kind of glacially slow to change, but they do change. And we do see, more universal understanding of, climate crisis than we did 20 years ago. So as frustrating it is to be in the mix of knowing new science and not seeing it applied to our, daily lives or our regulatory environments, it's frustrating. It's part of our reality. We have to have grace on ourselves, I think, in the journey. But there is an opportunity for us to accelerate it again by not relying on regulators and scientists to change the storm, but allow each of us, through common sense and our own experiential knowledge, to recognize, wow, when I was a kid, we didn't have a single child in my school with an EpiPen. Now you go to any westernized economy, and children have so many allergies that there's an epinephrine pen for avocados and every seed on the earth and nuts of every type. Like, maybe I had heard of some kid with a peanut allergy and that was it. Like,
that's exactly what my cousin was saying yesterday. She said these food intolerances and allergies are just going through the roof. That's so fascinating.
So for that, we solve it by our own experiential evidence of, in a single generation, this happened to our children. These children are not having the health benefits that we had growing up. And so we can become part of that solution. I want to look back at this document again and catch a couple more of these questions. I think there's some great ones in here.
Yeah.
Let's see here. This one here is, so if the goal is to eat food with no pesticide usage, what is the solution to provide equitable access to this food as it currently beyond a lot of people's budget. I think this is a very important one because
Critical.
you see this economic argument used all the time as to why we can't grow good food is expensive. Do you want to answer from your perspective there?
Well, we produced, as I think you know, Zach, a report called The Hidden Costs of UK Food back in 2017, and we kind of refreshed it a bit a couple of years later. And we did a very crude analysis of the uncosted negative financial impact, or the financial impact of the uncosted externalities, the damaging impacts which weren't part of the financial equation, behind our current food systems. And the headline was that if we spend £1 on food in a supermarket today, there's another hidden pound, split 50-50 between damage to public health and damage to natural capital and the environment, which doesn't appear on the price tag. And then the Rockefeller Foundation did another study a year or so ago where they said, no, it's not £2, it's £3. So that doesn't solve the question as challenge, which is how can we make nutritious, vital food available to everyone? And my short answer to that would be, let's say there's 20 to 30% of the population for whom the cost of food is this very serious barrier right now, especially in the recession and everything else. I think we have to find ways for governments to intervene to make sure that right is the right of every citizen. But while we do that, it's also worth remembering that back in the 1970s in the UK, it's probably the same in the US, around 30% of our disposable income was spent on food, and it's now below 10% here in the UK. So we are just allocating a lower priority to our nutrition, and instead we're spending enormous amounts of our taxpayers' money on the so-called National Health Service. So I think we have to practice honest economics is the first point. And secondly, if there are real failures of the economy to allow people to have access to good food, then government intervention is appropriate.
I think you nailed it. And I think that, that last statistic you shared there, where in the US, I think the numbers were around 50% of household income in the 1940s was put towards food and resources in the home like that, whereas now it's 15%. And so those statistics are stunning. And it means that we're spending more money on televisions, iPads, iPhones than we are on food. And so we've become so consumer centric in our metrics of, economic wellness that we have left food out of the equation for too long. And for that, we are paying this very high price tag. In the United States, we're at $4 trillion a year on healthcare spending now. And our entire agriculture budget is around 1.5 billion. So 3 times larger than our entire agriculture budget is the cost of dealing with the consequences of our bad food system. So the hidden costs are no longer hidden. They are undermining the very economies that drive this global economic system. So we are undermining productivity with that disease rate. We're undermining, the stability of global currencies. Like it is so damaging. The cost cannot be overemphasized of poor food systems.
And one other thing I'd add, which I think Darina Allen, who's one of the panelists on our Feeding Britain panel on Friday, she would say people need to learn how to cook again, because for 2 generations, cookery hasn't really been on the educational agenda properly. And if young people learn how to cook, they can buy relatively nutritious ingredients, cook them themselves, and have a much more affordable, good budget, a good food intake than they would otherwise be the case if they buy all the food that is currently their normal diet. I mean, it's a huge. I don't think we should underestimate the food poverty challenge that we're in at the moment. It's really important to acknowledge it. But I think everything you've just said, this business about making food pricing honest, because it is dishonest at the moment. We don't really, cheap food isn't cheap at all, as you've just indicated. And it's a long process to get this right, but we can get it right.
That's right. And we can see this at the individual level. This will answer one more question before we close here. But one of the questions is, how does glyphosate directly relate to obesity and the undermining of metabolism for the population? And it's literally what you just said in some ways, which is we are delivering calories, but not nutrients to the consumer now. And once delivered, that calorie can't get inside a human cell into a productive energy source because of the breakdown of the microbiome. So glyphosate as a chemical antibiotic is destroying the ecology of the soil system, leaving residue in the plant and water that you now consume, and it devastates the bacteria within your gut and within your body itself. It turns out that every organ system in the body has its own unique microbiome in a healthy state. We are not sterile beings. We're an organic garden in every single organ system. And when you start eating these residues of antibiotics, you start dying back that population. But the human body is now understood to be about 1.4 quadrillion bacteria, which pales in comparison to 14 quadrillion mitochondria, which are tiny little bacteria that live inside your cells, and they are the most sensitive to glyphosate. And so what happens is that when you start to expose a population to a little bit of glyphosate, 1970s and 1976 is the first kind of large-scale rollout of glyphosate in the US. By 1981, we had an obesity epidemic for the first time in the country, 5 years. And so the Reagan administration, Nancy Bush and Nancy Reagan both got on this, obesity as an epidemic kind of a thing, and the war against obesity in the US and all this in the 1980s and early 90s. And so we were seeing the metabolic consequences of antibiotics in our food system because we were killing the mitochondria inside our cells. And when mitochondria die, no matter how many calories you eat, they can't be turned back into energy. And so that they get stored in your belly fat. And so the visceral fat starts to accumulate. So you get obesity, not because there's a lack of calories, there's a lack of workforce to get those calories into usable fuel. And so that bottleneck started in the 1980s. And as mentioned earlier, the old model of cancer was DNA damage. And now we understand that cancer is actually a metabolic phenomenon. So 10 years after the advent of obesity, you see the takeoff of cancer. And so obesity was the precursor or harbinger of the crisis that would become today's cancer epidemic globally. And glyphosate does it uniquely by two mechanisms. One, antimicrobial, and two, undermines protein synthesis by disrupting amino acid reservoirs within the soil, plant, and body. And so when you lose protein structure, you start to get leak across systems. So the advent of leaky gut in the entire population happened because glyphosate directly damages the proteins that are the Velcro between our gut and immune system, our gut and blood-brain barrier, for example. All of these systems of barriers break down under glyphosate. So glyphosate destroys the barriers, creates leak across the system, which accelerates inflammation, and then kills the metabolism that would be the regenerative force behind that injury.
It makes me feel, have a quick look through the questions while I'm saying this, Zach, but it moves me to hear you say that, because it's so obvious that something is going wrong with our nutrition and with the health of the population. You only have to look around you when you travel, or just if you go into your local town or city, see that there are a lot of people who are not healthy, who are deeply unhealthy, including people who are becoming obese. And what really strikes me is that one needs to feel enormous compassion towards these people, because it's not their fault. I mean, they're victims of this terrible chain of events you've just described. It really is a scandal that we've allowed the situation to get so serious, where, not one but two generations of young people are afflicted by these conditions, which are directly related, not the only cause, as we know, but pretty substantially linked to the industrialization of farming and the over-processing of food. And we really have to do something about it.
That's beautifully said. Well, we'll wrap with this question here, and maybe it's a two-part question, but we'll wrap here. But it says here, I think that many people are addicted to processed food. Any comments on that addiction process? What's your perspective on that kind of chemical addiction that we have to the modern food system?
Yeah, well, I was thinking yesterday that one of the things that about sugar and about all these flavors that, all these chemical companies put into the food to make them very addictive, is it's rather ironic that we were hardwired back in the day, before sugars were widely available, to love sugar for good reasons. And now it's become so widely available. And it's the same with, all the foods that we are addicted to and tricked by these flavorists to become even more addicted to, used to be important and scarce in our diets, didn't they? Back before we industrialized farming. And it's such a terrible irony that we've now got into this situation.
It is a terrible irony, but I would point out, interestingly, that sugarcane was the main crop that allowed for widespread slavery to occur in Africa and in the colonial countries. And so, in Africa, they actually imported Indian labor, to grow the sugarcane in the late 1800s. In other colonial slavery models, they were importing Africans outward. So,
Yeah.
this whole pattern was around the sugar trade. And that's for hundreds of years now, 400 years at least. And so sugarcane and sugar beets became a phenomenon because, like you say, calories were a neurologic metric for survival. And so we were metric for at the brain level to seek out calorie dense foods for our own survival. And yet we didn't have an obesity epidemic till the 1980s. And so what happened was not too much sugar, it was sugar that carried the antibiotics that would kill the mitochondria that would use the glucose. And so that's where we really ran into the problem, was when we started chemical agriculture on these fundamental crops of high glycemic index wheat, and grains and corn, and on and on and on. And so I think it's correct that we are addicted to fat, salt, sugar combinations, no question. But I think there's a deeper addiction that precedes all of this disease, which is convenience. All of us are addicted to convenience.
Yeah.
Until we start to realize the cost of convenience in our own lives, this comes down to relationships. If you're trying to have convenient relationships, you probably don't have any deep relationships. And so it takes a deep commitment, energy. It takes energy to stay in relationship. And the main flaw for human survival at this point is our relationship to nature. And we need to get over our convenience addiction to our relationship with nature. We can't just run out and go look at the sunset and think we're connected to nature. We can't go run to the national park twice a year and think that we know what nature is. That is a convenience model for the consumption of beauty of nature. We need to bring the beauty of nature into our daily lives. We need to rewild humanity back into this ecosystem that we call Earth. And we will become a productive part of the solution. So I honor you, Patrick, for what you've done for 50 years on that farm. It is the underpinnings of a new future that we all know in our hearts is possible. And so let's all go out there together and create that. Thank you all in the audience for participating. Great set of questions there. And I'm sorry we didn't get to every last one, but I think we got about half of them knocked out there. So thanks for your participation. And Patrick, what a joy to be connected to you again.
Well, it's the same. And I'd just like to thank you for, in a really relatively short period of time, for bringing so much knowledge into the world, which have benefited so many people, myself included. And may your future influence accelerate in the way that it already has, because the world certainly needs your brilliant insights and your illumination of these very complex issues more than ever today. So thanks so much, Zach, for joining me tonight in our terms. And I'm sure many people will watch this after the event, and I hope that they do. So thank you, everyone, for tuning into this.
Glad to be with you all. And by the way, Farmers Footprint UK is watching. So pay attention.
I'd just like you to give, do you want to promote any links, Zach, just to make sure?
Farmersfootprint.us is kind of the harbinger there. We have farmersfootprint.org.au for Australia, the Australian organization. Farmersfootprint.uk is quick coming as well. But right now, farmersfootprint.us is your main place to go see the impact of regenerative agriculture. And if you want to see the impact of soil science on human biology, that's intelligenceofnature.com. And those are some places to go if you want all of my education stuff, all that free stuff, zachbushmd.com.
Brilliant. Well, to be continued.
Likewise, Patrick, such a good thing to see. Thank you.
Brilliant.
All, making
all the best, everyone.
Real.